You were born in a house just outside the town walls, which is exactly where society prefers to store its necessary discomforts. Your mother said you didn't cry for hours after birth, just stared like you were already evaluating someone's neck angle. That was probably a joke. Though with your family, it's hard to tell. Your father was a professional, not a merchant, not a soldier, not a farmer. Something rarer. He worked for the city, he wore black, and he had a set of tools that were stored under the floorboards and never mentioned by name. As a child, you were told not to touch the axe, not to play near the block, and not to talk about what your father did when he went to town. That left very little to talk about at all. You learned quickly that silence was your second language. When you were 5, you saw your first execution. It was supposed to be a family outing. There were pies, minstrels, and drunk men shouting theology. You sat on your father's shoulders while he adjusted the hood over his face. What you remember isn't the act itself, but the sound the crowd made, a mix of delight, disgust, and relief, like watching justice and theater made awkwardly in public. Later that evening, your father let you carry part of the scaffold back home. It was sticky. You didn't ask questions. That was your first day on the job. You didn't have friends exactly. Other children were told to keep their distance. You weren't bullied. You were treated like a contagious legal clause. In the market, bakers gave you bread by dropping it from a height. Dogs avoided you, cats stared, but that's just what they do. One evening, your father sat you down and said it was time you understood the duty. He used that word, duty, as if it explained everything. What followed wasn't a speech, but a string of muttered phrases and tool names. He wasn't trying to scare you. That's what made it worse. Once you tied a string around the neck of the family pig and sentenced her to death for excessive grunting. Your mother saw, she didn't yell, just took off her apron and said, "That's enough for today." The pig lived. The game didn't. At 8, you asked your mother why people acted strange around you. She said, "Some people fear what they depend on." Then she handed you a bowl of stew and told you to eat before it got cold, both the food and the world. Your real training began around age 11. First, knots. Then the theory of weight versus resistance. Your father didn't explain morality or justice. He explained angles, friction, and wind. You were being taught how to make terrible things happen efficiently. You were essentially an engineer with questionable PR. The first time you helped with a real execution, you fainted. Not from blood. From the way the man's wife looked at you. You got back up. You held the rope steady. You went home and vomited into the bushes. The next day, your father told you that was part of it. He didn't specify what it meant. By 15, you were on every town record as apprentice executioner. A stable job, good pay, and the complete social life of a wet broom. When other boys were learning swordplay or how to flirt, you were practicing knot strength and cleaning bone dust off your shoes. Fun fact, bone dust sticks. You tried making a friend once, a blacksmith's son who didn't flinch when you handed him a mallet. You helped him repair a cartwheel. He laughed at something you said. A week later, he left a note under a rock near your door. It read, "You seem decent. But you're you." You didn't reply. You kept the note for longer than you should have. Then you fed it to the fire like it might finally warm something. Your father wasn't cruel. He simply treated life like a list of tasks, and you were one of them. On your 16th birthday, he gave you your own mask. Not a new one. His old one. "Tradition," he said. The leather still smelled like sweat and judgment. Around the same time, you carved a small bird out of wood and gave it to a girl who sold eggs at the market. It took you 4 evenings to make. She smiled, thanked you, and called you kind. She didn't know who you were. A few days later, she walked past the square during a minor sentencing. Nothing dramatic, just your father reading a name while you held the rope. She froze for a moment, then kept walking. Past you, past the crowd. She never looked at you again, not once. At 17, you performed your first execution unsupervised. A thief? Young, probably your age. You tried to be precise. The crowd appreciated it. The town paid you early. That evening, your father poured you a drink and said, "No one wants this job. That's why it matters." You weren't sure if it was meant to comfort you or warn you. You didn't sleep for 3 days. When you turned 18, your father retired. Not with ceremony. He simply stopped showing up and started carving spoons. He said it kept his hands busy. You suspected it kept his memories quiet. And so by 19, you were the official executioner of a small, God-fearing, hypocrisy-powered European town. You had a steady income, a heavy key to the city gallows, and the personal charisma of an open wound. The local girls were polite, the local clergy were not. You tried to attend Mass once. The priest hesitated, then said you were welcome to pray from outside. "The Lord knows you're there," he added, which was meant kindly, but sounded a lot like judgment. You remember walking past a child who whispered to her mother, "Is that death?" The mother didn't correct her. She just nodded and crossed herself. And honestly, it was hard to argue. In your early 20s, you were good at your job, which was unfortunate. Because the better you got, the more they called you. And the more they called you, the more you realized that people didn't want justice. They wanted reassurance, spectacle, and a designated villain to outsource their discomfort. You were perfect for it. You began traveling, not far, just from town to town, like a very grim freelancer. You carried your tools in a wooden trunk. The trunk had a name, you didn't name it, someone else did. The box of ending? Charming, really. Sometimes you were hired by nobility, sometimes by church courts. Once by a man who technically hired you to execute himself. Long story, very philosophical, ended with a rope and a handshake. That night, you drank alone and tried to forget that the man had tipped you. The towns all blurred together. Same cobblestones, same crowds, same eyes. Only the condemned changed. Occasionally they shouted that they were innocent. That was the easy part. The hard part was when they didn't say anything at all. At 26, you were granted a house by the city council. It came with a plot of land, 2 chickens, and explicit instructions not to attend town festivals. You planted herbs. They thrived. No one stole from your garden. You attempted love again. It went better than expected, which is to say, she didn't scream. She was a widow with a sideways smile and a practical attitude toward mortality. You talked, you ate in silence, you shared a bed. It wasn't romance, but it was warmer than the execution platform. She had children from a previous husband. They never called you father. They called you him. You didn't correct them. Honestly, you've been called worse. At 31, you executed someone you knew. Not closely, just a butcher you once drank with. He looked at you without anger, just exhaustion. You almost flinched. But your hands remembered the motions and the crowd remembered to cheer. That night, your wife touched your face and said nothing. You were grateful. Sometimes people asked what it felt like. You never told them the truth. The truth was, the first few were hard. The rest were muscle memory. You started dreaming in measurements, in rope length, in crowd noise, in the smell of wet stone. By 35, your name was known. You were the clean one, the fast one. You were invited, professionally, not socially, to perform executions across the region. Towns liked it when things ended efficiently. Some even offered food baskets. You always declined. Seemed wrong to accept snacks after severing someone's legal existence. Your fame grew, your circle did not. You were respected, feared, ignored. You tried keeping a journal. It turned into a list of names and dates. You stopped. The local priest began including a special prayer for those in difficult positions. He never named you, but he looked in your direction. You tried attending Mass once more. A woman moved her child to the other pew. A man muttered something about unclean hands. You left before communion. You kept the bread anyway. Your only real companion was a pig, a fat, intelligent creature with no fear of you. You fed her apples and talked to her about weather and ethics. She never interrupted. She listened better than most men of God, and smelled better too. When she died, you buried her next to the herb garden and marked the spot with your old boots. At 42, you trained an apprentice. He had quick hands, sharp eyes, and absolutely no interest in the moral dimensions of the profession. You disliked him immediately. He reminded you of who you might have been without your doubts, which unfortunately made him perfect for the job. You taught him everything: how to check knots, how to manage crowds, how to avoid flinching. You didn't teach him how to sleep at night, mostly because you never figured that part out. By 45, you were still working, still necessary, still alone. Sometimes people said your presence made them nervous. You wanted to tell them it made you nervous too. By your late 40s, the crowds began to look younger. Or maybe you just looked older. Your joints hurt in ways no prayer or wine could fix. The mask felt heavier, the axe somehow lighter. You suspected you were simply losing sensation. You worked slower. Not worse, just slower. The city didn't complain. You were reliable, punctual, and at this point seen as part of the architecture like a well-maintained drain. No one praised you, but when things ran smoothly, they nodded and moved on. Your apprentice took over more duties. He had none of your hesitation and all of your precision. People said he was efficient. You suspected they meant less human. Once you told him not to strike twice unless absolutely necessary. He shrugged and said, "They're not coming back either way." You didn't reply, but you stopped eating with him after that. From then on, you only reminded him to oil the hinges and double-check the beam tension. You weren't passing on wisdom, just a checklist. The last execution you performed was a botched one. Not because you failed, because your hands shook. You hadn't noticed it until afterward when the blood didn't pool where it was supposed to and the apprentice quietly cleaned up behind you. You stood for a long time on the platform as the crowd shuffled away, their appetite for punishment briefly dulled by the sight of mortality on both ends of the blade. After that, you officially retired. The city paid you a small sum, a formal letter, and asked you politely to remain available in case of backlog. You never were. You had backlog of your own, memories mostly, and some arthritis. You spent your days tending the garden, reading psalms you didn't fully believe, and watching your apprentice become the man people whispered about. They no longer called him your name. They gave him a new one colder. One day, the town hanged a boy for stealing a coin. You weren't involved. You only heard about it from a merchant who said it went smoothly. That night, you drank bad wine and talked to the wind. It didn't answer, which was better than most people. You died quietly, not in the square, not in the dark, just in bed. Alone, unless you count the smell of iron and time. Your heart simply gave up, perhaps out of politeness. The city paid your widow a modest sum. The town record noted your passing. Your apprentice attended the burial. He didn't speak. He just placed your old hood on the grave and walked away. You weren't sure if it was a gesture of respect or just over time. Your grave had no name, just a number and the words "servant of order." No one visited, no one prayed. But the kids still ran past the square a little faster, and the wooden platform remained colder than the rest of the stone, even in summer. Sometimes they say your ghost lingers, not as a figure, just a feeling, that something is watching, that justice has weight, that death once had an employee. And maybe that's what your life was. Not a tragedy, not a horror story. Just a long shift in a uniform no one wanted, doing work everyone demanded. Being a medieval executioner was like being a punctuation mark in a language of fear. You didn't write the sentences, you just ended them. Thanks for watching. You might never find me again, so follow me if you want more.